Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to talk about The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. So this is a classic story. I'm not going to go into granular detail about the plot or anything. I just want to kind of talk about it from the perspective of it being a classic that has inspired so many other works of fiction, as well as many comic book characters and variations on just this idea. It's created essentially a literary and a media trope, so I kind of want to talk about it from that perspective. So yeah, as always, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and let's begin. So one of the first things I noticed about this story when I grabbed the audiobook and added it to my cart and stuff was that the pronunciation of the name is different. So I've always understood it as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, kind of like the animal jackal, but Jekyll, but it's really Jekyll, like Geekel, like it's Jekyll. Like, so it's apparently a very, or was a very common surname in England at the time. So Robert Louis Stevenson, that was the way he intended it to be pronounced. But by the time there started, by the time the story started to begin, by the time the story started to get adapted, people had changed the pronunciation to what, phonetically it kind of is. So ever since the 1930s adaptation of the story and where they pronounced it Dr. Jekyll, they essentially destroyed all the other copies, all the other adaptations where they pronounced it Jekyll. So therefore, by just pop culture osmosis, everyone kind of knew it as Jekyll. So it kind of stuck. And it's still the most common pronunciation and the most well-known version of the way to pronounce the name. But I just found it fascinating that it's a completely different pronunciation. And I kind of like the way Jekyll sounds better than Jekyll. I don't know why. It's just an arbitrary preference, I guess. But I thought that was one of the first really interesting things about it, based on my perception of it from pop culture osmosis, as opposed to actually looking into the work. So another thing, similar to the way Stephen King wrote Carrie, in that the story itself is kind of written as a police report procedural situation after the events of the story have taken place. The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is kind of similar to that. The story is really told through a lot of reports, a lot of doctor's notes, and a lot of just people recollecting things and like relaying information to each other after the fact of these things having happened. So a lot of the events that we see happen in a lot of adaptations actually come from this letter that Mr. Hyde slash Dr. Jekyll wrote in the story, and one of his lawyer friend actually finds it and reads it, and essentially it's the full exposition dump about everything that's been happening in the background of the story, because essentially the story moves almost as a murder mystery, and that things are happening and people are unaware who's doing it, who is this person that we've heard of, what's going on, who hurt this person, what happened here, that kind of thing. So we're really following it from the perspective of the people that just don't have all the pieces they need until the very end. I thought that was interesting because, as I said already, most of the adaptations that I've seen clearly take that exposition dump at the end and just layer it out through the rest of the story, because all the events that I'm familiar with in the story just tend to happen in the story and, not save for the end the way it is in the actual novella. So I thought that was quite fascinating as well. So it allows people to take a very concise kind of few pages essentially of the story, and you can stretch that out and create multiple adaptations. So one of the main reasons why this story has been adapted and readapted and reused and stuff, and kind of has inspired multiple other things, is because of the themes. Robert Louis Stevenson already had an interest in this idea of personality duality kind of thing, a good, evil, devil, angel on the shoulders kind of thing. He already was very much interested in the subject, so he wrote short stories previous to writing this novella, exploring those same themes. So it's a really interesting concept that he, of course, had to play with, and I think that one of the catalyst inspirations that really hit him was when he became slightly involved in a murder case. One of his friends actually was convicted and executed for murdering his wife. So he was actually able to kind of take this idea of the person that he knew versus the actions that they apparently committed, and kind of it further pushed this idea of good and evil duality that exists in every person. So it seems to be the final push that led him to actually write this story. And I think it's really interesting that most adaptations nowadays will have him be the green monster, the almost ape-like kind of thing with the crazy hair and stuff like that. When in the books, it's very clear that the evil side, the Mr. Hyde, is really supposed to be the repressed kind of instincts of like what we would just consider like fun and frivolity kind of thing, kind of harmless, kind of degeneracy, I guess I'll call it, like nowadays, because it comes from a time of such staunch like British propriety and stuff like that, that he's kind of speaking in this way that he has to be this perfect, staunch, stiff upper lip kind of perfect example of British aristocracy, along with being a good representation of his own profession. So he's basically never cut loose, for lack of a better term, in his entire life. So the Mr. Hyde personality is essentially that. It's not so much cartoonishly evil or comic book evil or really, actual monster. It's really more about the repressed side of who he is actually coming out. And it's kind of a story about if we don't like allow some of those impulses out in safe ways and like minor ways, then they can build up and become terrible, because the entire personality of Hyde is just made up of that. It's shown that because it's all completely built up in him, he basically becomes a type of creature, almost a type of monster, to the point where people will describe him saying they can't really point what's wrong with him, but he seemed to have some sort of deformity. They can't just point and say, oh, he's, got crazy teeth or crazy hair or anything, but there's just something about him that feels off, because he's pretty much all pure malice. So the crimes that he commits are really crimes of passion in a lot of ways, because it's this built up kind of id that he doesn't get to express ever because of the nature of the society that Dr. Jekyll is in. So I think that's very fascinating. I think that entire concept itself is one of the reasons why the theme in this story has lived for so long. Even though the majority of the adaptations kind of just cut and dry, is less subtle than that, except for the one of the more recent adaptations in the TV show Penny Dreadful from Showtime. I think it's Showtime or Stars, one of those. But I think that adaptation was really good, even though we never truly see a proper Mr. Hyde. The Dr. Jekyll and the entire way that story works, I love. But I think these themes, these ideas are some of the main reasons why this story is so incredibly long-lived. The idea of this id, this repressed part of yourself, becoming an entire monster and kind of being a dual part of the personality is very much was the primary focus of the creation of the character of the Hulk. So even the various adaptations of Mr. Hyde have gone from just being kind of a disheveled looking guy or an evil looking guy to a pure monster, to the point where it got even like the Wicked Witch of the East, where eventually the media adaptations of this character will make the face green because they're monstrous and stuff. So there's even multiple adaptations of Mr. Hyde where he's green. Like one of my favorite adaptations, because I grew up in a time when we had the DARE program, Drop Everything and Read. So reading was being pushed heavily by the government and all kinds of groups and stuff. So we were just constantly encouraged to read. So Hollywood, of course, got in on this too. So they produced a movie called Page Master. It was shortly after the Home Alone hype of Macaulay Culkin and stuff. So he was in it. We had Whoopi Goldberg in it. There's just a lot of 90s A-list stars in it. And it was partially animation and partially live action. So the story is essentially about a kid who goes to the library and finds all the adventures and stuff that you can find when you read fiction books and stuff like that. But of course, it being an animated movie, all of these stories come to life. And one of the coolest ones is the Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde one. When they pull the book and it like kind of all comes to life. It's the coolest thing ever. And this adaptation is the first time I got a direct visual of Mr. Hyde. This is the first time I ever really had any concept of the story. So my initial impression was that he was always green because of this version of him. And this is also one of the things that probably led me down the scary stuff path, because this scared the crap out of me as a kid. But it is interesting that, much like the Wicked Witch, a lot of adaptations of Edward Hyde after the fact makes him green, much like they do in Looney Tunes. The Mr. Hyde in the Bugs Bunny cartoon is also green. So it's an interesting idea that this monstrous, evil, kind of repressed part of the personality, it becomes green. And then that followed all the way through to creations of characters like the Hulk. Even though the Hulk originally was gray when he was first created and had a far more Frankenstein kind of look, almost one kind of similar to some of the versions of Mr. Hyde as well. But later on, he of course becomes green, which is either purposeful because of the multiple adaptations of Mr. Hyde is green, or just an interesting coincidence. The themes of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde are so universal that they can even be interpreted on a nuance level to mean multiple other things that are not just as clear cut as like the id, ego, and superego nature of the personality, or even just the public life versus private life or anything like that. It's also been interpreted to be a story about addiction multiple times because, of course, the idea of the imbibing a substance and you becoming someone else totally different, it can obviously be a metaphor for alcoholism. It can be any sort of drug addiction. It can even be something as much as gaming. Like if somebody doesn't get to their 5 hours of Call of Duty or something, do they become a ravenous crazy freak or something? Like, it can be all kinds of things. It's such a universal concept, and there's so many different ways in which it can be used. Even though most people nowadays do not ascribe to the idea that the personality or the human mind is a dual, binarial kind of thing, good and evil kind of thing. Everyone kind of understands that the world really is multiple shades of gray. But nonetheless, this story as this obvious dichotomy, this kind of good evil kind of bisection thing, is very easily used. It's very fun to use it as well. So there's even adaptations within other classic adaptations that make use of this trope, like Alvin and the Chipmunks meet the Wolfman. It's already an adaptation of the Wolfman, but in the movie they're doing a play of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, and when one of the characters, Theodore, is bitten by a werewolf, because they're already chipmunks, he turns every night instead of every full moon. So it's played like a Jekyll and Hyde thing because Theodore's personality changes when he shifts into the were-chipmunk, the were-monk. So yeah, so it's a really interesting idea, and it plays on all those different themes about being a repressed person versus being that open, belligerent kind of person. So that adaptation, I think, has so many different layers of the adaptation that it's got to be one of my favorites. There's also, I could name them forever. There's League of Extraordinary Gentlemen, Van Helsing, the multiple adaptations of the story outright itself. There's just so many different ways in which this trope has been used, from League of Extraordinary Gentlemen by Alan Moore, that direct version, not even the film version. It's kind of different. It also is one that I think acknowledges more of the story than most other adaptations, because the nature of how in the story Mr. Hyde is described as squat and like smaller and stuff. It's kind of this interesting implication that it's the side of himself that he doesn't get to use, doesn't get to make use of, and is constantly repressed. So it's literally underdeveloped. So Mr. Hyde is smaller and slighter and stuff than Dr. Henry Jekyll. So it's fascinating that in the Alan Moore story, he decides that because Mr. Hyde is constantly out, he makes mention of having been smaller before, but because he's out all the time, he grows. He gets bigger and bigger to the point where he is like this big hulking kind of figure, like in the movie adaptation. So I think that's really interesting. I think Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, The Strange Case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is a universal story with some great themes that are infinitely applicable, can be applied anywhere. You can interpret most stories even in terms of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. Like in Joe Abercrombie's The First Law series, there's a character named Logan Ninefingers who has this berserker rage type situation that he deals with. It is clearly a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde situation, because when he goes into the Bloody Nine rage, he's called the Bloody Nine, so there's a hint for you. But it's just a constant theme, and it's a through line that I really like, and it's a story trope that it's a story archetype trope that I really enjoy, and I really want to see more interesting adaptations, more creative adaptations of this idea. So after exploring this story and a lot of the adaptations, I fully and completely understand why Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde is a full-blown classic. And from then until now, and until probably another 100 years in the future, we will definitely see works that have been totally inspired by this awesome story. So yeah, let me know in the comments down below, what's your favorite adaptation of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde? And if there are any other interesting literary classics you all want to talk about in the month of October, my favorite month of the year, let me know about that in the comments down below. We'll definitely talk about it. So as always, make sure you hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already, and I will talk to you all next time. Peace.